Okay, so for our second workshop, we have Aga Dixon from Drummond Woodsum. Many of you have met Aga before. She's helped us on a number of issues, most recently around buildings for our future. So Aga is representing the firm today. As you know, back in June, I believe, Chair Figdor asked us to engage with our attorneys to do an in-depth review of the city charter as it relates to the governance of schools, and particularly against the framework of state policy. So really helping the board to understand what are the limits and the possibilities for the Charter Commission as it begins its work in earnest, and particularly around the governance of schools. And so Aga and her colleagues drafted the memo that you've had for a while that does that, looks at the governance of schools in state statute, and then how that is represented in the charter, and does an analysis of what is, what's possible and what isn't possible in, as the Charter Commission does its work. We also asked them to do a sort of side-by-side look at other large municipal corporations in the state to sort of compare and contrast the city charter in Portland to those charters. And so they've also done that. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aga to sort of walk us through the memo. And then I think the second part of what we wanted to provide is an opportunity for the board to obviously ask questions about that, but then also to formulate any sort of broader direction and goals for us to bring back to the Charter Commission as it engages in its work. We've shared the memo with the Charter Commission leadership, as well as their education committee's leadership. I don't know if any of the charter members are. I don't see them in the attendees, but we're certainly recording this so that they'll also be able to revisit that. And I've received, a message from one of the Charter Commission members saying that they wanted us to provide some direction. And so this conversation will help us to shape what that direction might be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Aga. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Javier. Wonderful to be here with all of you. You have the memo. I'm not going to read it out loud, but I thought what I would do is give you a couple of key takeaway messages from the memo as you engage with the Charter Commission and think about what the school board's role should be in that process. So first and foremost, I'm going to say something that you all already know, but is sometimes lost in the dialogue, in the public dialogue about school governance. And that is that Portland Public Schools is a separate legal entity, completely separate from the city of Portland. And that serves as a really important foundational piece to understanding the school board's authority in relation to the city council's authority, and as well as in relation to the roles and responsibilities of the voters or the municipal legislative body of the city, whether that be the council or the voters. So bear that important principle in mind as we have this discussion, because it really does serve as the foundation for understanding the limits of the Charter Commission's responsibility and the limits of the charter itself in regulating matters of school governance, management, and finances. So as I pointed out in the memo, the Commission's authority, and really the authority of any charter in Maine, is really constrained by the Maine Constitution as well as state law. And as you know, state law regulates public education quite extensively. So the second concept that's really key to understanding these limitations is what is called home rule authority. And this is the municipal concept that municipalities, cities and towns in Maine can regulate matters of local importance, and they can regulate matters of broader importance so long as there's no conflict with state law regulation. And where there is a conflict, those areas that are already regulated by the state legislature, are really off limits to regulation by municipalities, either through ordinance or by charter. So that concept of limiting home rule authority to those areas that are of local importance and that are matters that are not otherwise regulated by the city, that's really the second important foundational concept to keep in mind. And as you well know, public education is an area that is heavily regulated by the state. So we all know, for example, that the legislature has imposed very prescribed steps for, school budget approvals, for example, and many, many other matters of school governance and management. So where the state legislature has spoken on an issue of school governance or policy, local regulation by charter is really prohibited in those arenas. So those are the broad legal concepts to keep in mind. One of the, if you've looked at a number of charters, whether it's the Portland Charter or other city charters, you'll see that there's quite a bit of language in these charters that speaks to public education. So there are areas of governance and management that are fully within the purview of a charter to speak to. And one good example is the school board election process. Pretty much every charter, I think every charter without exception, has a procedure by which to elect school board officials, sometimes there's a procedure to recall school board officials, and fill vacancies and things like that. And that's an example of a matter, a local matter where a charter can address those issues. In terms of the school budget, however, things get a little complicated. Now, we all know the usual process. That process has been in place for well over a decade now, where the budget is prepared by the school board. It is then presented to the municipal legislative body for adoption, and then it goes through the budget validation process again. What the state legislature, the Constitution, and the Maine courts have said about this process is that essentially a charter may modify the school budget approval process, but it cannot modify or alter the power of the school board to direct expenditures of education funds, or the responsibility of the municipal legislative body to ultimately adopt or determine the total school budget. Now, we were asked to check into a situation where, what is a municipal legislative body? And that is a good question. In every city charter that we reviewed, and I believe this is the case across the board for the state, the municipal legislative body for purposes of determining the total budget is the city council. However, the state law concerning this doesn't identify the council as being the sole or exclusive possible municipal legislative body. So while in all of the charters that we reviewed, all of the city charters that we reviewed, that was the case, it could be that the municipal legislative body could be some other entity. And if you think about what legislative body is, it's really one of three things. You either have a city council or a town council, or you have the voters. And, there is, or the town, the town meeting in municipalities. So while there's probably some opportunity for the city, for the charter commission to look at that question of who adopts the ultimate budget for the school, this is an area that we would want to look over very carefully if that is proposed to be changed, because it would be a deviation from the norm.
Ms. Dixon, could I just clarify? So what you're saying here is that potentially in Portland, the municipal legislative body could be the voters.
It could be, yeah. It would just be potentially an onerous process, because we also have a budget validation referendum where the total budget is taken to the voters. So there's an interesting legal question about how to potentially structure a charter provision where the authority to approve the total budget is taken to the municipal legislative body in the first instance. If that's the voters, then what do you do with the budget validation referendum?
And would there be a way to structure two questions? So you address the first question and then the second at the same, on the same voting day?
On the same voting day? I'm not sure. We'd have to look into that and see if that would pass muster. The challenge here is to make sure that not only the local process is feasible, logistically feasible, but also that it meets all of the state law requirements for the school budget adoption procedures. And there are some timelines in there. There are ways to eliminate the budget validation referendum process through a vote a vote by the voters. And some communities, some school districts have done that. What I will say at this juncture is we've not really explored what the possible options are or alternatives are to the current framework. But I will emphasize that the current framework is the leading framework for, city charters. And that we've only found really one exception to this process, and that was through a town meeting process that could be potentially a model, but it could raise some logistical problems for the city. And so whatever deviation may be proposed in this arena would really require a lot of careful legal review and thinking on.
I hear that. It does also, I will note that there are places in which Portland is already the only municipality implementing a certain form, a specific form of government. That's not really what I'm intending to say. But for instance, with our elections for school board and city council being ranked choice,
Yes.
I believe we're the only community in the state that does that.
I believe that's the case too. Yeah. And I think another area where Portland's charter is distinct is having a recall procedure for school board directors, for example. That's not always in charters. So there are definitely areas of distinction. And just because everyone else is doing it this way doesn't mean that it's the only way of doing it, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Would the school board, could the school board be the legislative body?
It could not. It could not. I think the school board, under the current understanding, we could do some legal research on this, but I think the answer is no. The current, the definition of a legislative body is essentially the voters of a district, of an electoral district, or their elected representatives.
Could
So,
the council name some other entity to be their legislative body? So could they create a budget setting commission or entity to do that work? And
I'm not sure the council could, but the charter may be able to. So there's a real question about whether through the charter process, the voters could adopt a new form of a municipal legislative body, essentially an elected board like the council, that has the distinct role of adopting the budget. And just to go back to clarify, the reason I don't think that the school board could be that entity, but we could certainly look into that, is because the school board has been delegated the governing body of the Portland Public Schools. And so there's a question that is raised as to whether or not there's a separation of powers concern there. It's certainly something we haven't researched deeply, though, and if that is something of interest, we could dig in a little more. So one other point that I wanted to draw to your attention is that, there's been a lot of discussion and understandably about the school budget approval process and what shape that could take. But if you look at the charter, actually the overwhelming majority of the provisions related to the school board and school governance have nothing to do with the budget. So there is a lot of room for their charter commission to review those provisions, particularly when it comes to procurement matters governing really the management of schools, as opposed to the policy decision-making that is within your purview. And what I found interesting as I was looking at the Portland Charter is that there are quite a few provisions in the charter that are much more detailed and onerous than many other city charters in this arena. So I've outlined those in the memo, and I've also given you, a very comprehensive side-by-side comparison that I won't dive into, but you have some examples of where Portland's charter is quite detailed, whereas other charters are either silent or have very little to say about a particular topic. Conflicts of interest is a good example of that. And I think the reason for that is because there is already a robust framework, regulating conflicts of interest in some of these other areas through, if not through state law, then through case law, through the law of Maine's courts, that Maine's courts have established over time. So it may be worth looking at those, and if you find that they are administratively onerous, this may be an opportunity to have the Charter Commission look at those and give some thought to where it makes sense for the charters to speak on some of these issues and where it makes sense to perhaps be silent on them. But I will leave you with one final thought, which is that it's really, this isn't quite a good opportunity for the school board to really interject itself into the process and think through where, where the decision-making authority should rest with respect to not just matters of school budget decisions, but also more broadly management of schools. As you do that, I would, however, caution you that this is an area of the law that is quite complex. You have an overlay of constitutional principles, of state legislative decision-making, and local decision-making, and they all interact in pretty complicated ways. So however you decide to move forward, if you have ideas or questions or thoughts on or suggestions to the Charter Commission, would just really strongly recommend that you keep us involved in that process to provide you with guidance, because it's quite easy to step over those legal lines.
Who advises the Charter Commission on the legality of their proposals and pursuits and so on?
I'm not sure if that question has been specifically answered. I believe that Commission has available to it an attorney, a municipal attorney, that they could use as they wish. I think there's been some discussion about the Charter Commission seeking its own attorney. So I'm not sure where they are in that process. And of course, at least one member of the commission is an attorney himself. So he would be able to understand and navigate through these thorny issues.
Ms. Dixon, I have, there's one other area which you didn't touch on that I found very interesting in the memo, and that was around the CIP process.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like in other municipalities in Maine, for instance, there is a development of the CIP, a joint process to develop that among the mayor or city leadership and the school leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I saw that in one municipality, there was a 5-year CIP, and I was particularly interested in that. And if you can speak to that, because one real challenge in Portland is that you never can count on a CIP other than the year in which you're, other than the budget year in which you're voting, because it's a new, potentially a new council, and the decisions shift. So, for instance, like back in the day, there was an effort to renovate our elementary schools by putting specific projects on the CIP every year, and those projects would essentially disappear as other priorities came up. So I wanted to get clarity on whether there are municipalities in which there's a 5-year CIP that is adopted, and if that and how that works.
Yeah, I think the whole CIP process, first and foremost, is within the purview of the charter. So to my knowledge, there's no state law limitation on how that's regulated, and it is a local matter. In most of the charters that we reviewed, you're correct, there is an active role for both the superintendent to coordinate with the city manager and for the school board to jointly make decisions with the city council on CIP priorities. So that is a very common model, that there is coordination during that planning process, both at the administrative level and at the level of elected officials. And in terms of time frame, I'm not familiar with the city charters so much as I am with town proceedings in that arena, but at least at the town level, it's quite common to have a 5-year CIP process rather than a 1-year. Like I said, we can look into it, but I don't think there's a restriction, a state law limitation on the CIP process. And I would be surprised if there were any legal barrier to establishing a 5-year plan rather than a 1-year.
I guess I'm wondering, and maybe this is a detail we don't need to get into now, but I'm wondering if there's a 5-year CIP planning process, I would assume that there's opportunities to make amendments as, situations change. Anyway, perhaps a level of detail that we don't need at this point.
We currently have a 5-year, actually a 10-year CIP. It's under you right there. A 10-year CIP, and I do think that it changes significantly from year to year. And I guess, related.
I think what I read in the memo is that other municipalities we have a multi-year CIP, but the only year that we actually are required to stick to what is in that plan is the current budget year. So that's a big difference in my mind, because like I said, it makes it very hard to plan capital improvements when things shift so much.
Yeah. I guess a related question, and I think I know the answer to it, but I still want to ask it. Would the school board, if the charter designated it, would the school board be able to determine CIP? So in essence, formulate a bonding requirement for the city without the city council's approval?
That I would have to get back to you on. That gets complicated not only because of this state law overlay that we've been discussing, but also because of underlying bonding requirements and who can actually authorize, essentially grant the full faith and credit of the city's properties, the property of this within the city at large to as security for those bonds. So we can certainly look into it. I think it's anytime you get into questions of altering the bond, the approval of general obligation bonds, I think even if the charter could do so, there may be other reasons why it might not be wise to do so. And we would definitely want to talk to Bill Stockmeyer, among others, to make sure that there are no unintended consequences there.
Are there other questions from the board? Well, perhaps then, oh, yes, Ms. Travar.
Are we just doing questions right now, or is it?
Oh, well, I was going to say maybe we could move into more of a discussion.
Okay.
And I think it might behoove us to start with some principles for, to the extent that we are, understanding and perhaps coming together with some recommendations for the Charter Commission. Are there principles that we want to use to guide those recommendations? And so I had a couple.
You have some thoughts,
but I also, if you want to,
I mean, I just kind of, I'm in having thought about this, kind of coming into it. I'm interested. Well, I have been interested in the idea of whether or not we could have our own control over our own budget. And having been part of the last Charter Commission, that was an issue that we talked about. That's when we implemented the requirement for joint meetings of the finance committees throughout the budget process. So it's something that has been sort of an adversarial process. And I think perhaps continues to be so today. And in my mind, one sort of big thing that's problematic is that the council and the school board hear from different constituencies, apparently, during the process, and that puts us in a place where, we're advocating as a school board for, fully funding our educational needs, where the council is hearing from a constituency that's more concerned with responsibility to sustainability of the property tax rate. And it just kind of puts us in an adversarial position. So that's kind of, and maybe to Ms. Figdor, your point of principles on how to think of what we want to address. That's the principle, is like, what are the sort of problems that we're facing that we can find some structural solution to. And that's why that, to me, the budget process is an area of interest. Although now I'm hearing it's probably complicated to be able to address it. So just to note, that's one area I'm interested in continuing to look at. I also agree with the idea with CIP. Currently, to me, it feels like we're very much at sort of the whim of just whatever is allocated to us that year. And so are there things structurally that would give us a greater voice at the forefront of the process in terms of CIP? Because our needs are always great in that area. I'm always interested in the electoral stuff, but I am having trouble identifying an area that I find problematic in our current system. So I'm sort of I have less of a sort of gumption to delve into that area. And then the last piece that I kind of wanted to just put out there on the table, which is a little bit maybe off in a different direction, but the Charter Commission may be considering issues that are not specific to school management or governance, but that are nevertheless important to the school district. And particularly the issue of non-citizen voting comes to mind. And the board passed a resolution in support of that back in 2018. And I thought perhaps, we might want, if we're going to participate in some way in terms of making recommendations to the Charter Commission, perhaps we want to kind of like broaden what we're looking at and maybe include that in our set of recommendations. So just a thought in terms of, where we kind of end in this process. So those are just sort of my thoughts at the moment.
Thank you, Ms. Trevorrow. Those are very helpful, and you clearly have a unique perspective having served on the Charter Commission the last time. So thank you. So I'll just throw out and I don't know if we need to discuss them, but when I'm thinking about the Charter Commission and how, and recommendations we might make, or what I as a school board member would want to see come out of the Charter Commission from the perspective of how we structure our work here in Portland, is that I would like the process to be more democratic and to have more participation. So those are kind of two principles that are in the back of my mind. I think the budget process, as it stands, is political right away, because our job is to look at what we need to actually educate our kids. But the first meeting with the council's finance committee often starts with them asking, and them telling us a number that we need to work towards. So right away, we make the process political. So figuring out how we can back out of that so that we're actually first prioritizing what we need to educate our kids, I think would be really valuable coming out of this process. And it ends up feeling and not very democratic, because there's a lot of public support for public education in Portland and for doing what we need to educate our kids, and yet the council has at times been a barrier towards getting the resources we need. So that is not felt when we go to the budget referendum, including when we've passed budget increases, we've had really good results. And or on the for-school bond. We know, the city comes out for public education. And so our job is to provide the education our kids need. And yet we right away politicize the process every year by the council telling us a number that we need to work towards. So I think recognizing the limitations that Ms. Dixon described to us and that are spelled out in this memo, I think if within those limitations, we can think about how to take politics out of the budget process and have it be more about what is needed to educate our kids. I think that would be, hugely valuable. I'm also, definitely very interested in the CIP process so that we're more equals. It's too often as where things are structured now that we do not feel like we're on equal footing with city government. So I think that would be a big step forward, and certainly on immigrant voting as well. I would be very interested in moving forward on that. There are some other issues as well, but I think Ms. Russell-Better had her hand up. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Rodriguez, go ahead, please.
I guess, first of all, I agree with much of what Chair Figdor and Board Member Trevorrow just said. And I particularly that last piece, I was hoping that we would get into ways, and it might not be through the board, but definitely there are items that the Charter Commission will take on that would have an impact on us, like the non-citizen voting question. So I hope that we could also expand our conversation to that. I do like the idea of having more autonomy on passing our school budget, and for all the reasons that we've said, and to avoid the political piece. I will say that I wonder how much of the politicizing is the process and how much of it is the people involved. I can't say that I was following Portland school budgets 10 years ago. But given that we are at this point being very purposeful with our investments and that we have a comprehensive plan that we're tying to our budgets, what I've seen is a disconnect between the council and the school board. And, we own the comprehensive plan. They don't. So we see these investments from a very logical and programmatic point of view. They see it as a bottom line. So that, to your point, that I think lends itself to politicizing it because we're approaching it from two different objectives. So I would look forward to eliminating that. And then the other thing is, and I don't know how much the charter would help. I'm sorry that I'm not facing you when I'm speaking. The other thing that I'm not sure if the charter would help us to address it, but what I've experienced or what I've observed over the last 5 years that creates problems for us is when someone in the city makes a decision unilaterally that has an impact on us financially. So I recall, for example, when the fueling station was changed, and that was a decision that the manager made unilaterally, would have had a financial impact on us because we had to then figure out what we were going to do with our buses. And, we found out about that at the 11th hour, had to scramble, not the best of processes. And I'm not entirely sure that the charter addresses that. But again, there's a decision there that was made by one body that the other one had to scramble to figure out. And I don't know if that's, again, people or process. I'm sure I can come up with a couple other instances for examples, but I think I've made my point. Oh, the other part, I noticed that we have an extensive list of conflicts of interest compared to other charters.
Yes.
I think having clarity in those conflicts of interest is really important. I just wonder if you can give us any thoughts around that discrepancy. I just find it odd that so many other municipalities had no mention in their charters about that. So
It's actually surprising that the Portland Charter has so many conflict provisions, only because there, as I mentioned earlier, there is quite a robust conflicts, a series of both state laws and case law on conflicts of interest. So this is not really an area where there's a lot of confusion or lack of understanding about when conflicts exist among elected officials. They're almost identical for school board elected officials as they are for counselors or select board members on the municipal side of the equation. So I found it surprising. Actually, I found the flip side of that coin surprising, that Portland had so many, because I think it's probably not necessary in light of that legal framework that already exists. That says, does it hurt? No, so long as the provisions in the charter are consistent with those other legal frameworks. And so I've not taken the effort to try to do that analysis. But it was interesting to note that there was quite a disparity in that category. I agree.
Okay, that's really, I appreciate you saying that, and that is interesting that, like you said, that it's unnecessary. It might seem. That's all I had. Thank you.
Just a technical follow-up on that. So are you saying that the Charter Commission, that the charter goes beyond the current framework, or does it modify the current framework?
I have not done that analysis, so I'm not sure if it goes beyond. I think it's at a level of detail that's much higher than in any other charter that we reviewed. And I suspect the reason the other charters are either silent or almost silent on this topic is because there's quite a bit of legal statutory language and case law on this topic already. But like I said, I'm not sure if it goes beyond, if it's a clarification at this point, or if it's just duplicating what's in current law.
Mr. Ferrara?
Just to follow up on that, it would be interesting to know if it goes beyond, because, there's obviously an intent in all of this language, right? So, whoever drafted that language at the time, was it the intent to, create a sentiment that something, even perceptions of conflict of interest were, frowned upon or something like that. And then it raises the question of, do we as a city still hold that sentiment? Because there's, perhaps a counter side that says elected officials have a responsibility to engage in the work that they're supposed to, so long as they don't have a conflict of interest. So it would be interesting to know that and see if we kind of hold the perspective of whatever we think it's trying to advocate.
I had some questions for the superintendent, and maybe, you don't have to answer them now, but it would be helpful to think about some of the provisions in the charter now and how they affect our budget process and our overall management issues, and see if there are changes that would facilitate our work.
I don't know them off the top of my head. but
Something
yeah,
something for us to.
Yeah. And I mean, many of them are the things that have already been raised today.
Mhm.
So I don't, I think beyond that, it would be more sort of technical nuance than it is sort of broad issues of, autonomy and decision-making. I think those are ultimately the big issues. There are things like the timing of when we need to put out a budget versus when the city puts out a budget.
Right.
I think those are, that hasn't come up specifically, but it's something that, we've noted before. I think there are issues around the sort of the process for replacing board members after they leave that, could, they haven't really affected the district during my tenure, but have the potential to do so, in very short order with, potentially people leaving the board and having, 7 members on the board for, a prolonged period of time. And then potentially actually having people elected, after a fairly long break that then would need to run for reelection in, less than 4 months. So I think those are the kinds of things that are, that are issues. I personally, believe, and I think you articulated the principles of more democratic and more participatory that I think resonate with me. And so I actually believe, very strongly that, if not for all elections, for, school budget referendums that, and school board elections, that non-citizen voting is something that would, give a voice to, very important members of our community who don't have a voice in, in electing school board or passing the budget, that, that I think they should absolutely have a voice. And so, and that isn't something that affects us, directly in the current charter, but is something that, I know that's come up several times today, and that I believe would make us, a stronger organization aligned to the goals that we've set out of being, more equitable and elevating the voices that, traditionally are not at the table. So.
Yes, Ms. Bando.
Yeah, and I think what I've been observed is that I tried just to understand until now, because I heard you mention that we are a separate legal institution. But when I look at the process where we're going through during the budget and the way different steps, then, the joint meeting, then board member cannot speak about, making any comment about the budget. We just been observing everything being, deciding in our place. So that means the power, the check and balance of the power then as a separate legal institution is not applying the way I've been seeing. So I feel like, the power do this is not really reflecting us as a officially elected. I feel like sometimes we've been downsized, like, we just there and then somebody else is making a decision for something they're not aware. So I wonder if something is a revision of the process can be something that we can try to apply with the new charter. Just that check of balance then, should be recognized and more respectful when it comes to the budget process and then the different area of our concern, because we are all public elected, but being the specific legal institution of the public school, I think we should have a little more power to do this. That's what I was thinking.
Ms. Bando, it's interesting that you said that, because I was thinking through a third principle. So more democratic, having the structure being more democratic, more participatory. And then this isn't the right phrase, but better executing our equal footing with the council, because in so many cases, as you're reflecting on, it does not feel like we have that equal footing. Yeah. Ms. Russell Better.
Thank you, Chair. So this is maybe in relation to what Ms. Bondo just spoke to, but also earlier, the Chair and Mr. Rodriguez's comments. I just wanted to add my language around the lack of, or what I would wish to have as more of a collaborative process, which I think is what others have spoken to. Just that it is such a separate process. So I'm not saying specifically how I would see that happening, but that, Mr. Rodriguez mentioned the disconnect, so there's the comprehensive plan that we understand, and we understand why the budget is what it is. And then there's the piece of the amount, and just that, the lack of collaborative process, until it's at the last minute of about this amount, right? So I guess I'm just, noting that some piece of the process being more that there's some back and forth, and also the point Mr. Rodriguez mentioned about decisions made by one body affecting the other, that I just think there's not the context or understanding to then be saying, this is what we want you to do with the money at this point, when there really isn't that understanding of how the budget was developed. So I guess collaboration and maybe more of a process of understanding how our bodies affect one another and in that process. So that's just, where my mind's going. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Russell Better. Mr. Burke, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to stay off camera because I got freaked out when I see my huge head behind y'all. I agree with the points that you were kind of synthesizing, Chair, and I would say pointedly on the budget, the budget to voters versus through the council is aligned with what seems reflective of the outcomes that we see ultimately, and would reduce the political nature and the frustrating process, I think, for both bodies. The CIP, ensuring the superintendent is included in preparation and submission at a minimum seems to make sense. And the other two items, and then the other items that we discussed, like voting for residents that are non-citizens, things of that nature, I support. Things that I have heard might be part of the charter process, and I don't know if we have an opinion on them at all, but is, the total number of members in our body and the at-large position, particularly when it comes from an equity consideration, being that the at-large position can be prohibitive for participation due to the increased number of signatures that are needed, as well as usually capital amounts that need to be raised for those races. So is it not more equitable to have more district level seats? And does the total body number need to be increased? And then lastly, our position on clean elections, whether that's relevant as a body or it's just individual members. Those are things that have come to mind for me during this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Well, I'm wondering for next steps if there's a smaller group of us that would like to work on an initial draft of recommendations that we would consider, or if there's some other process that you would like to undertake. I mean, I guess I would propose for folks who are most interested and have the time, we could get together and start to come up with a draft proposal, and then we can come back to the full board and present it.
The only thing I think that's fine. I just, obviously want to remind you of notice and, public participation in any, discussion by board members that, leads to specific board action. So I think that's one thing. I can also summarize the notes from today and get that to the board, and then you can decide where you want to go with it from there. But
okay. Yeah. Mr. Rodriguez.
I was going to ask, what was our anticipated timeline, and how do we expect to communicate it to the commission? It's just going to be a forwarding a letter, or a formal, any other formality?
I mean, you know,
Just FYI. I don't
yeah,
know.
I mentioned that we had gotten a message from the Charter Commission to, at some point, come and speak to them on these issues. So I think that it is timely. There wasn't a specific date or anything along those lines. You know, I copied you on my response and so on. So I think, you know, there is a sense that they want to hear from the board.
Yeah,
And I
their
know that
education committee has
there
met
is a
twice
meeting.
already.
There's a meeting on October 6th, and both Ms. Trevorrow and myself have been invited. But that's just one, that's with the education committee. So that's just one forum. I think we could decide to present this in any way that we want. So I think it remains to be seen. Maybe as the next step, we start with the superintendent summarizing this conversation, and then we can go from there. Okay.
I think I mentioned
Chair.
you did send a memo to the Charter Commission. I don't know if I said that or not.
Mr. Burke, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it makes sense to refer this to a specific committee, and that would address a number of the issues that were just raised in terms of notice and such.
Oh, Mr. Burke, what a good idea. Could we refer it to the policy committee?
Yeah, you can refer it to any committee that you want. I would say policy or finance seem to be the ones that sort of
Good
jump out
point.
to me. But
Good point.
Maybe we could do a joint referral, or we could do joint meetings with policy and finance. I would like to be involved in, you know, whatever working group is doing this. Unfortunately, I do have time limitations currently, but I also have some resources to give, particularly to the non-citizen voting topic. So I just, you know, I think it would, I'd like to be involved in the process. It would be helpful to have, like, you know, somebody do the initial draft, I think.
I wonder if we could, I like the idea of referring it to an established committee. Thank you, Mr. Burke. I wonder if it actually might make more sense to refer it to finance. And my thinking is because the policy committee agenda is full right now, and we need to get through some big pieces of work on the policy committee. It's a quieter time on the finance committee, given that we're through the budget process for this current school year. Any thoughts or feedback on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, we can always go to other committee meetings, right? So
Exactly.
if members were
Exactly.
interested in joining, that would be,
Exactly.
so that sounds good to me.
And Ms. Trevorrow, I hear your time limitations, and I am very interested in this and can engage more deeply in.
Yeah, and we
formulating a
have,
proposal.
you know, we have our regularly scheduled finance committee meeting coming up in October, which I think is the second Thursday.
Mhm.
So, you know, maybe we can have sort of a you know, first crack at something that we can just work on from that meeting forward.
Mr. Superintendent, are you supportive of this approach?
absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So I think we'll go ahead and do that, unless I hear any objections. I see lots of nods. Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Dixon. This memo has been very helpful. Really appreciate your coming to us tonight and helping talk us through it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And if there isn't anything else, we can go ahead and conclude this workshop. Thank you so much, everyone, for your work tonight. And see you at our next meeting.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.